Hello, everybody. My name is Roger Longman. I'm with a company called Real Endpoints, and we are an advisory firm focused around the area of reimbursement, particularly in terms of first defining value and pricing, and then figuring out not regular contracting, but alternative contracting, the kind of contracting that I think most gene and cell therapy companies are thinking about. And then finally in patient services. We heard this morning in the opening session that the big issue is as you commercialize, is how do patients get access? And essentially that's what this panel is about. But instead of taking solely the manufacturer's point of view, we are taking the point of view of a manufacturer, a payer, and a PBM. So I figured that I would just start with a quick introduction to the topic. And the point is, I think, kind of encapsulated in this very crowded slide. If you think about the world as it has changed over the last couple of years, the customer base for your products has become, in essence, for 70–80% of the population, roughly 3 large integrated organizations. That's 70–80% of the prescriptions in the United States. One of those is on the dais today, ESI, which merged with Cigna. The others are United Optum and Aetna CVS. The challenge is that they have become, the challenge for companies like yourselves, the companies who are creating the innovation in this industry, is that they've got to somehow go through those companies in order to get patients access to their products. And while the productivity of this industry is extraordinary, and I'm just talking about orphan drugs for the moment, there is, and frankly, the cell gene therapies that we saw in Janet's presentation this morning, which are a big part of that growth, we see this enormous productivity. Well, the issue there, of course, is the challenge, right? As the pipeline grows, so does the competition. So what you've seen is this enormous increase in competitive density within virtually every category. And in particular, I guess I'd point out that we have this enormous increase in competitive density in orphan diseases. So even something like SMA, which we heard a little bit about today, is going to have like 5 therapies competing in there. Something like hemophilia, which is, I guess, not really an orphan, is going to have multiple therapies. If you think about all these other diseases in lysosomal storage disorders, we're going to have multiple competing therapies. All of which means that there is going to be more competition for payers to be able to pit one against another. Now, there are a variety of approaches to ameliorating that condition, that situation, one of which we're going to be talking about today, and that is alternative contracting models, risk sharing. And I've got on this slide a number of the recent deals, including several that have been done by at least one of the people on this dais, which reflect a variety of different structures, including structures which are what we would call based around a clinical outcome. Does the drug work to reduce or otherwise prevent the clinical symptom or the clinical sequelae of the disease, or of the economic outcomes Does this drug actually reduce costs by working better? And some are just sort of alternative payment models or a combination of those, in which case you get drugs that are paid over time. And so, for example, I think, I will not, I guess I am kind of prejudiced. I really do love how Bluebird Bio is working these days. I'm impressed by that company, and am particularly impressed by this deal that they have looked at in terms of structuring how they're going to work on Zynteglo over, paying it over 5 years, but with a risk-sharing approach to it, so that if the drug doesn't work, it ain't gonna get paid for at its full price. It's really quite an impressive idea. But the point is that there are many approaches, and that the reasons for these many approaches are, yes, to get patients access, but this would not be as necessary if the drug prices weren't so high, and if there weren't going to be competition, and there is going to be competition. That's what's weird about this whole situation. All of these companies were created and have had huge valuations, largely based on the notion that orphan diseases like cancer before it and gene therapy would not have competition. Payers would not be able to step in and say no to these products. That's just not true. In fact, I'm not going to spend time on this. I'm going to spend time with my panel. But I will just mention one thing. We will be talking about oncology versus non-oncology conditions. And I do want to say that oncology is still a kind of special place. Now, 40% of the orphan pipeline, at least, is in oncology, and that is treated differently. But if you are in a non-oncology condition, for a variety of reasons, you will be seen more like a regular therapeutic category than the special one that oncology is. And we can go into those reasons later. So with that brief introduction to the topic of the day, let me introduce my panelists. So to my extreme left, not necessarily politically, is my friend Bernie Good. Bernie runs the value-based work out of UPMC. UPMC, University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, is a unique place. I've worked a lot with them. They are an integrated delivery system. They've got a couple of million lives. They are unique in how closely the payer that UPMC is works with the clinical organization, which is UPMC. So it's a wonderful laboratory, experimental laboratory for actually doing these kinds of programs, and Bernie runs that project, and he had spent a whole lot of time before that at the VA, essentially running pharmacy for them. To Bernie's right, we have Bill Martin. Bill is at Express Scripts, where he runs pharma strategy. He has been, importantly for this audience, he has also been one of the senior people running the specialty pharmacies for the Accredo business for Express Scripts, which is another extraordinarily important linchpin in anybody's distribution and reimbursement strategy. And finally, to Bill's right, we have John Coombs. John runs maybe I'm overstating this, John, but John essentially runs the reimbursement and access strategy for Kymriah, which, as you all know, is one of the 2 CAR-T therapies. Is there only 2? Please say there is only 2.
There's 2 so far.
2, okay. 2 CAR-T therapies on the market. John's a Pharm.D but he is also an extraordinarily experienced health economist, went to school in that as well, so is very familiar with the, how shall I say, the math and policy side of that world as well. So, how we're going to run this, I'm going to ask a bunch of questions, but we're going to leave, we've got about 20 minutes left in the whole thing for questions from the audience. I don't mind, and I am assuming, I'm just going to assume away, that my panelists do not mind if you want to interrupt and ask questions, because we got some time for that as well. So, okay? All right. Whoa, it's a very low chair. And as a short person, I begin to wonder about things like that. So Bernie, you're running the UPMC value-based contracting program. You've done a number of contracts. Compared, for example, to the more common diseases, and I'm thinking of a very innovative contract that you've done called on a diabetes product called Jardiance. What's different about creating a risk-sharing deal in an area like gene or cell therapy than one in a more chronic condition like diabetes or cardiovascular?
Thanks. So with Jardiance or some of the other contracts that we've been working on, they involve large patient populations, and these are drugs that are going to have to be taken continually. And what we've tried to do in that space is to look for innovative ways in which to look for to be able to show a value proposition with those drugs. And it's been fun working with our industry partners. Everyone seems to be interested. Everyone's a little skittish, but seems to be interested in this concept. When you start looking at gene therapies, and there's so many on the horizon, we only have a few in the space right now, but I think there's several different scenarios that we have to grapple with. One is the rare condition that's expensive, offers great benefit to patients, and it's not going to break the bank. And the example there would be drugs for SMA, Zolgensma. The flip side is drugs that aren't going to save money, but will improve the quality of life of patients. And the other example there would be Luxturna, where patients experience some improved vision. But at least from our standpoint of view, it's going to be a costly technology. Again, though, it's rare enough that it's not going to break the bank. I think the big challenge for us is thinking about some of the earlier slides that we saw, looking at some of the gene therapies that are pretty far along and hopefully will come to the market soon. So you mentioned hemophilia. So a health plan like UPMC, we have well over 100 patients that have moderate or severe hemophilia, and their factor requirements are quite high. And so a lot of these, if not all of these patients, would be candidates for gene therapy once it becomes. Well, if you do try to think about the math there for, we have 3.1 million covered lives, but if even a small population there, if the technology is in the millions, and I can't imagine it not being, a gene therapy not being in the millions, do the math, it's quite a bit of money, and that will have an impact. And so I think in situations like there, we're going to have to be much more creative in figuring out ways to finance it, and some of the ideas that have been brought up already today are good, I think a good way to start, but I think we have a lot of challenges ahead.
So just to follow up, your concern isn't so much your inability to do a creative, innovative structure with a drug like Zolgensma or Luxturna because they are for so few people. Your concern is more like what happens when wet AMD hits, when hemophilia hits, when the non-orphan therapies. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, the sheer volume is going to create a lot of challenges. And so even though I'm sure, ICER will do their reports, and we love the work that they do, and they'll come out and say, these technologies are, probably for patients, for certain patients, they're cost saving, like if gene therapy for hemophilia B. If you have inhibitors, gene therapy will almost certainly be cost saving, but it'll be cost savings over a period of time. So even though it's cost effective, what do you do with the large number of patients who will want access to that therapy? So we'll have to think about creative ways to work on value-based contracts, which recognize the financial difficulties or challenges, I should say, that health payers will face.
One quick follow-up. Do you think some early stage companies should be going to you now if they've got a therapy for one of the for either a small or a large disease, and talking to you about it, or is that?
So we're having a lot of
relevant?
internal conversations, but if you're out there and you have something that's going to come to the market soon, and we would welcome those conversations.
John, let's move to Kymriah for a second. You rolled out Kymriah with an outcomes-based contract. What'd you learn from it? What were the challenges? What might you do differently this time?
Thanks. So with Kymriah, Novartis not only was innovating in the science and bringing the first CAR T to the market, but we also were innovative in the sense that we brought forward indication-based pricing for the two different indications. So we have an approval in lymphoma, one price for lymphoma, completely distinct population from the approval in leukemia.
Pediatric.
So the pediatric leukemia indication is the indication that has the outcomes-based approach. And so Novartis rolled this out to all of the participating hospitals in the Kymriah network, and we continue to offer it today. It's a voluntary agreement, and so when hospitals agree to participate in this outcomes-based approach, effectively what they're doing is they are agreeing to not bill a third party if a patient doesn't achieve a complete remission within a specified time period, and the time period that we have in this agreement is between day 28 and 35. And that ties in with the usual clinical practice for those oncologists who are typically looking for a response in their patient after 4 weeks. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But I said that this is an agreement. It's two parts. It's between the hospital and Novartis. So the hospital agrees not to bill a third-party payer, and therefore this agreement extends to all third-party payers. So commercial payers immediately benefit from it, Medicaid benefits, Medicare benefits. The agreement on the Novartis side is that the hospital tells us there was no response in that child, we don't send a bill. So there's no bill for Kymriah moving through the healthcare system if that child didn't get that complete remission.
Mm-hmm. And okay, so that's the program. What have you learned from it that you would do differently next time, if anything?
Sure. So we thought that we had started far enough in advance, Bernie had the good advice: come talk early to the payers and hospitals and other stakeholders. That's absolutely a recommendation to anyone who's considering bringing forward any kind of a value-based approach. If it's outcomes-based or if it's indication-based, start to identify your stakeholders, start to talk to them early, and do your homework. Other learnings around this is that it's hard to be innovative. It's really challenging to bring forward.
It's hard to be innovative because it's hard to come up with this idea, or it's hard to actually convince somebody to go along with you once you've got it?
It's hard to come up with an idea that is feasible and practical. Right. And the structure around that really has to come from a lot of conversations with your stakeholders.
Right.
And I think that when you look to bring forward something that's feasible, it has to work first, it has to work for the patients. You have to make sure that patient safety is maintained. It also has to work for the stakeholders. People have to understand the reason for participating in this type of approach. I'll share a story. I was speaking with a Medicaid director, and the Medicaid director was still getting up to speed, trying to understand what is CAR T, and in particular, why they should provide access to their beneficiaries with their limited funds to Kymriah. And so I asked the question back to the medical director, if a physician comes to you with a clinically appropriate patient for Kymriah, and you deny Kymriah, what treatment would that patient likely get? And the medical director responded, that patient will likely get transplant. So then I asked another question for the Medicaid director. I said, well, with transplant, if transplant doesn't work, do you still pay? And the Medicaid director said, well, yes, we pay if it doesn't work. I said, well, with Kymriah, it's different. For these children, if they don't get the complete remission, there's no bill coming from Novartis to the hospital and no bill from the hospital to you. Patients got access.
And he said, go to hell, or what did he say?
I think that was the moment of clarity and understanding for that Medicaid director, that not only was Kymriah a viable therapeutic option for patients within that population, but they also understood the role that Novartis was taking to help Kymriah be a sustainable component of their healthcare system.
They would have to pay, though, for the hospitalization, the Medicare. So they're not totally off the hook, right?
Yeah, but
There's a fair amount of hospital costs, so they would still be on the hook for that. It was just they wouldn't have to they wouldn't have to pay for the drug.
That's right. There wouldn't be a cost for the drug.
Right.
Right. So let me now turn to you, Bill. There are 3 organizations in the United States which have well, there are multiple formularies, but call it a formulary apiece. There are 3 organizations in the United States which have formularies which affect the vast majority of Americans. ESI's is, of course, one of them. Bill, we've now seen in the pipeline multiple competing really cool therapies in both small and large areas of gene therapy. You've got gene or RNAi or antibodies, a whole bunch of different technologies. So you've got hemophilias, you've got Duchenne's, you've got Parkinson's, you've got SMA, you've got beta thalassemia, you've got, Jesus, what was the one that Maury Ruffin told me about today? Epidermolysis bullosa, something like that, I don't know. But there are like a dozen of those. So if you think about this, are you going to start thinking, and then I'd like to ask you the same question, Bernie, are you guys thinking that you are going to start creating policies which, like you've done in RA and other places, in other categories, are going to start preferring or step editing one therapy after another or before another?
So, Roger, we're all beginning to crawl, and you're like at running full speed kind of question there. Because let's kind of go back to when you said there's 3 formularies in the U.S. There's a lot.
It's really dozens,
Yeah,
I recognize, but it's,
maybe hundreds, right? Because virtually every managed care organization has a formulary. They have a pharmacy formulary, they'll have a medical benefit formulary, and those are very, very commonplace. It's kind of universal that formularies and management is in place. And in the American system, the way it exists today, if you have like drugs, let's say like drugs with similar clinical profiles, side effect profiles, et cetera, and it's a viable alternative of, well, do you turn left in the road or turn right at the fork in the road? Is there a management opportunity there? And I think that answer is yes, but I don't think we're anywhere near getting to that in gene and cell therapies for the foreseeable future.
Bernie, what's your response? So let me just paraphrase you, Bill. No, we don't know whether or not we are going to do these policies. Is that right?
I would say that the managed care in the U.S., if it becomes viable because there are, we'll call them identical for purposes of the conversation, identical therapies, yes, management would likely happen.
Bernie?
We love competition. And so to the extent that these opportunities present themselves, I'm sure we'll work. So Express Scripts is our PBM at UPMC Health Plan. And I'm sure we'll be working with Express Scripts to identify opportunities where we can leverage. So we want to do the right thing for the patient first and foremost. But we also have other customers, and that's our, the people who buy our products, and they're very concerned about these costs. And so it's our job to try to make sure that we identify the best patients for these drugs to make sure that they're going to, have the best opportunity to work. And that's part of the beauty of having value-based contracts is it aligns everyone for the same sorts of outcomes. And then to look for other opportunities. So I don't know how quickly, I can't help but notice that there's a lot of players in some of the similar spaces. So I should stop talking about hemophilia, but there's a number of people in that space. So if the opportunity will be there, I'm sure we'll work together with our specialty pharmacy, with our PBM, and try to identify opportunities where we can get the best value for our customers, which include our patients.
Let me move on to another question around curative therapies. So one-time therapies, which are expensive, which have a different economic model than chronic care therapies have, are now foreseeable. Indeed, I think you could say that Kymriah is a curative therapy, right? The problem of these curative therapies, or the reimbursement problem today of these curative therapies, which are all new, is durability. What do we do if the therapy stops working? What do we do, and how do we address that challenge? Well, the Bluebird proposal is out there. You pay 20% annually over 5 years, and if it doesn't work in the first year, well, the drug cost is 20%. If it doesn't work after the second year, it's 40%, and so on and so forth. From your points of view, and then I'd like you, John, to respond to this as well, does that work? Is that a sensible way of doing things? What are the challenges with it?
I love the idea. I think the devil will be in the details. If you're paying 20% each year for 5 years, one of the assumptions is that the payer stays the same. But we know in the commercial space, especially when you look at the ACA patients, the exchange commercial patients, they move all around. And so how does that work? Does because the patient got the therapy. So if the patient gets the therapy with UPMC, and then God forbid they go to one of our competitors, are they going to step up and pay for it? So I think there's a lot of things that need to be worked out. I think that's probably, though, the best answer. Now the horizon is 5 years. That's assuming that if something lasts for 5 years, it'll continue to last. Maybe not, but it's certainly better than paying that full amount up front and really not being certain that the drug or this gene therapy will persist in its efficacy.
Yeah, and so what Bernie's kind of touching on there is this idea of portability, right? So portability, I think you sum up the portability discussion around if you're a net giver, meaning you have a patient that's going to someone else's plan, it's maybe not so bad. If you're a net receiver, that's kind of where the problem comes in. No one really wants to be the net receiver of it. I think going back to this question of the pay over time, and you really have to break that down to what are you talking about exactly? You're talking about taking the upfront purchase price and just spreading it out in what I would call amortized fashion, amortized payments? Or are we talking about a payment over time that is tied to outcomes, which is
Right.
you're saying. You know,
In fact, what we have is
20% a year for 5 years.
This is a combination.
That's right.
Pay over time / outcomes.
I mean, a practical, reality that we have today in our current environment is an obstacle to that. And most of the audience here, I think, is aware of this. For most manufacturers, is a view that triggers a best price issue, because best price in our country is based on a single transaction, right? So if you were to have a failure in year 1 or year 2, then new best price is 60 or 80 off, depending on
Bill,
how you
let's
look at
stop there
it.
for a second. Does everybody know what Medicaid best price is? Let me just quickly explain. Medicaid gets the better price of 23.1% discount, or the best price available in the market, and there are a couple of exceptions to that, but I don't want to go into them. The question here is, if you pay only, if your drug stops working after you have been paid 20% of the price, does that establish a new Medicaid best price? So if your drug was $1 million and now you've only paid, and you've got a risk-sharing agreement which gets you to $200,000 and then no more is paid, is the best price for Medicaid now $200,000? That's what you're talking about.
That's right. And the prevailing view right now across the board is absolutely it does. And it's interesting that it's called best price. I've heard it said, well, it's weird that it's called best price, because it's really kind of a floor for pricing or a ceiling for discounts is the way it actually functions in the market, rather than being a best price. But going back to that scenario, the prevailing view is absolutely it would set a new best price. So that is a impediment to just going forward with a 20 over 5 years, and then forgiving payments, the remaining payments, if there is an undesirable outcome or a failure or what have you. So there have been a couple of pilots proposed. There's a lot of dialogue that's currently going on around, could we have exceptions to best price for particular, programs and so forth. And that's a very active and healthy conversation that's happening right now. But like everything else in our healthcare system, you fix one thing and you kind of create a few other problems along with it. So wrestling with all that, I expect that to probably be debated for months to come, if not longer.
So John, just quickly to you, would this notion of a pay over time option be interesting to you, or have you thought about that? Why did you reject it, if you did reject it?
So, I mean, Novartis is experimenting and exploring any kind of innovative or novel way that can help ensure patients have access to the therapies we develop. That's why we develop, and that's why we spend so much time on it, to make sure that ultimately patients can get them. The constraints that were already articulated around patient portability and Medicaid best price, those are real. Those are real constraints.
Absolutely.
So that's why Novartis keeps exploring and experimenting with what else might work. And so Novartis also works with other groups, like with Duke Margolis. They are putting out tons of ideas. They've published a lot of really good white papers that I think a lot of people in the audience might want to go read and check out. There are a lot of really interesting ideas, but I would say take those ideas back to your office, sit down with your colleagues, and figure out if some of those ideas might actually work for the patient population that you're working on. So get close to your patients, understand their disease, their condition, how they move through the healthcare system, and whether one of those innovative approaches might actually work for how that patient moves through the healthcare system.
That's a good point. I do want to ask the audience, think about a question. We're ready to answer them. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. And I guess Paul has a question. Why did I not think of that before?
Coming.
Well, there's somebody coming down the
It's a cube.
stage with a cube.
Oh, wow. This is so on, isn't it? It's cool. So, put it in front of me? Yeah.
Wow.
So, question I have is about insulin, human insulin, right? I would use that as a model. So this guy comes up with a creative solution for Kymriah, expensive cell therapy. Going to take a while to get it through the bureaucratic system, which I find inexcusable, but okay, we'll live with that. But what about human insulin? So everybody complained to Lilly that their human insulin prices were too high. You need to bring the price down, although none of the price increases have gone to Lilly. They've gone mostly to PBMs. So the question is, they came out with a human insulin biosimilar version. Is it on your formulary or not?
You're asking that for ESI? Well,
For all of them.
let me just in general, your question is around what happens with, you have a biosimilar. Is a biosimilar always on the formulary or not, or is it on the formulary?
Why isn't the biosimilar for Lilly's human insulin on your formulary?
The formulary decisions are made based on lowest net cost. And just because something is a biosimilar does not necessarily mean it has the lowest net cost. And this is one of the challenges that it's very real in the marketplace today. Is just because a drug launches with a slightly lower list price and it's a biosimilar doesn't mean that it's competing effectively on a price basis with others in the category. It doesn't mean it's not. I'm just saying it, but it isn't. Otherwise, it'd have.
Is that because the discount isn't the same, or the rebate isn't the same?
It would be in aggregate.
In aggregate. Okay, but it wasn't slightly less, right? It was quite a bit less. The price of the biosimilar to human insulin.
No, again, I'm back to net prices. Just
right.
The
reason I bring this up is
net
because
price.
I think so. We get thrown a lot of feedback about what we should be doing, and then we do it. And this. And by the way, this was a large company that did this, not one of us innovative emerging companies, but a large company that took all the time and energy and effort to do that. And that particular product is not being used in the marketplace, and it baffles me. It really does. So if we start talking about new therapies, which I think is a great thing to talk about, what about when you're looking at the old stuff now that we're coming up with solutions to, but they're not being utilized? How long will it take, I guess, is a good question to ask.
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly, and you've got some emotion tied to this. I can tell that, and I'll say that this is a challenge we have now in the marketplace as a whole. First of all, we have to manage the older categories, right, effectively to make room or create financial headroom, if you want to call it, for these new therapies that are coming out. And part of that management is really like it's all things considered in terms of net cost. And low net cost will be its combination of the list price, its discounts, its rebates. All of those things get factored into it. And frankly, with biosimilars, I think we all know that biosimilars, if you look at their relative success in the country, they're still, well, I just won't say that they haven't overwhelmed any of us, I think, with their success in the market. And it's a number of factors. I mean, one of them is many of them are on the, we'll call it the buy and bill or physician administered side, the medical side, where the controls aren't quite as robust as are on the pharma benefit side. And the other thing is just getting back to the price competition. It has not been as aggressive as I think we would have expected it from some of the biosimilar manufacturers. Or you could say the brand manufacturers were more aggressive than we expected them to be. But either way, I mean, the mission of the managed care company is going to be to deliver savings to the plan sponsor. So that's why the net cost will drive the decision.
All right, let me move again. John, I have a question for you. When you launched Kymriah, one of the challenges was on the Medicare side. The drug, the therapy became more of an inpatient therapy than I think many of us expected it to be, and therefore became more, started incurring hospital costs that Medicare was not yet ready to pay for because it did not have the appropriate, how shall I say, the appropriate coding to do that. Am I right about this? What can you explain to us the Medicare issue that you had with Kymriah, and what is from that experience your advice to the folks out here when they launch their drugs?
So Medicare is a fascinating question and topic. So before I dive into that response, I'll just ask a quick poll of the audience. Raise your hand if anyone out there is an absolute expert in Medicare. That's unfortunate because I was hoping someone to raise their hands because I was going to come talk to you afterwards. Because my response is really based on what I've learned about Medicare working in this space for some time. Medicare is large, it's complex. You alluded to coding. Coding is just one of the key pieces. There's really three big areas that all the innovators have to think about. You got to think about coding, you have to think about coverage, and also payment policy, right? And the interaction across all of those. There are dedicated individuals within CMS that live in each of those buckets, each of those areas. So there are coding experts, there are coverage experts, and also payment policy experts. And as much as we would like to think that they are sharing learnings with each other and talking with each other, we're finding that more can be done inside of Medicare and across Medicare to help them draw the connections around coding, coverage, and payment that we would hope to see not only for CAR-T, but also for other innovative therapies. Let me dig deeper into coding since you brought it up. There are a different set of codes that CMS uses for inpatient and also outpatient. And Kymriah's clinical trials, their registrational studies were done in both the inpatient setting and the outpatient setting. And in my job, my role is to make sure that all clinically appropriate patients have access to Kymriah in the setting of care that the physician feels is best for that patient. So whether it's the inpatient setting or the outpatient setting. And so we had to make sure that the code set was available for patients to be treated with Kymriah in the inpatient setting or the outpatient setting. And it takes a lot of time to develop those codes. Some of those codes come directly from CMS. Other codes are developed by external bodies like the American Medical Association or the National Uniform Billing Committee. The next piece I mentioned was around coverage. CMS has recently published their final determination, a national coverage determination, that Medicare beneficiaries should have access to CAR-T therapies per label or per CMS-approved compendia at facilities that satisfy the REMS criteria. And that coverage process, that coverage determination process took well over a year. So we've already gone through coding and coverage, and the last piece is payment policy. Payment policy is also fascinating. It's fascinating to tons of people
Payment
within
policy
this.
is not fascinating,
Well,
John.
yeah.
Payment policy is boring, John.
It really is. Payment policy is fascinating if you truly care about your patients and making sure that they have timely access.
Okay.
And maybe that's one of my calls to action to the people in the room, right? So Medicare has different payment policies for inpatient care and outpatient care. And sometimes that impacts whether and how patients can be treated. And again, we want to make sure that the treatment site determination is left to the physician based on what's in the best interest for that patient. And that's not always the case.
But it's fair to say that what happened when Kymriah launched is the payments, Medicare's payments for inpatient use of Kymriah after a cytokine storm or something like that was less than adequate. Hospitals couldn't afford it.
So one of the things that CMS has done, you guys all had lunch, but I don't know any of you who had a bowl of acronym soup, so here it comes. The inpatient rule book is called IPPS, the Inpatient Prospective Payment System. The outpatient rule book is OPPS, the Outpatient Prospective Payment System. On the inpatient rule book, you need ICD-10 codes and procedure codes that lock your procedure into a specific DRG, a diagnosis-related group.
That's right.
So you've got to have the procedure code, you've got to have the DRG. But when that DRG doesn't fully accommodate the cost of the new technology,
the DRG is the amount of money that will be paid for that capitated program.
Yep,
Exactly.
perfect. So the sponsors, the innovators for the drugs, the devices, the procedures, they can apply for a new technology add-on payment, an NTAP. And you can apply once per year. You get one crack per year, that's it. And only a minority of drugs and procedures are awarded an NTAP. So it's less than a third. So CMS did authorize a new technology add-on payment for CAR-T therapies. So the first year that they authorized it, it was 50%. And then CMS, as they do every year, they have an open public comment period for their proposed rules. So IPPS rolls out proposed rules every year. The public is encouraged to comment on them, and this is my, again, action for you. If you guys are working on therapies that are 3 to 5 years, maybe 7 years from the market, start to get really familiar with the coding set and the payment policy that is going to impact your therapy based on its site of care and where those patients will be receiving care. So this year started actually yesterday in this year's fiscal payment cycle for Medicare for the inpatient. They increased the NTAP payment to 65%. But there were a lot of groups. That requested CMS to consider alternate payment models that would have more fully accommodated the cost of the therapy. So there are still some challenges and shortcomings around payment on the inpatient side. And again, that's the remit to all of you. Get familiar with the coding, coverage, and payment policies that may affect your therapies. Start to look right now in the rule book, and then pay attention when the rules come up for public comment, and make sure that you can comment. We comment each time we have the opportunity.
I also just want to say, I don't think I've been on a shareholder or analyst call in the last couple of years where I've actually heard an analyst ask the question, tell me about your Medicare coding strategy. It's just not there. But of course it is fundamental, as frankly Novartis found out. Let me move on to another issue. Most of the therapies that are being developed in this by the companies represented in this room are going to be medical benefit drugs. That is to say, in the theoretically in the buy and bill system. The buy and bill system, for those who don't know what that is the physician or the provider buys the therapy, marks it up a little bit, charges an administration fee, and then sends that bill to the payer. The payer has much less control over which drugs get used in the medical benefit side. And obviously there's an incentive for physicians to mark up that drug, or to frankly use the more expensive therapy, because if he's being paid on a percentage basis, he gets more money, or she gets more money. Do you expect this to be true going forward in cell and gene therapy? Will this medical benefit world actually be a buy and bill world? Go ahead, Bernie.
Well, I think in terms of having more or less control, I'm not sure that it will. I mean, these products will all be prior auth there because they'll be so expensive. So I don't think a physician would administer a very expensive drug without knowing that it's going to be covered by that health insurance. But the extraordinary cost, I think, will provide some challenges for those clinicians. You haven't mentioned 340B. That's the other sort of issue, and that I think will be quite interesting to see how that plays out. I know 340B is on, in the crosshairs of a number of the different plans that are being floated out there, but because they're so incredibly expensive, then those 340B payments will become quite remarkable, and I don't know how that's going to work out.
I'd say we're in for, I think, continuing to see a mix. And when we talk about the buy and bill, sometimes folks think buy and bill, these are physician administered, is always buy and bill, that's always medical benefit. Self-administered or shipped with a patient label is always pharmacy benefit. The reality is it's kind of a mix there. You can send a patient label, can go from the pharmacy to the hospital for administration to the patient. It can go with a patient label on it, or the hospital can buy it wholesale and do the traditional, buy and bill. One of the things that drives this mix that I'm referring to, that you really will see all different combinations, is back to your comment around, well, a provider purchases the drug and then they mark it up a little bit. Well, in some cases they mark it up a little bit. In some cases they mark it up a lot, because that's the contract between the payer and the hospital. And therein kind of rises one of the challenges that we all have got to be innovative around addressing, which is that puts the payer then in an untenable situation if they have just using it by way of example, 400% markup on a $2 million drug. That's just, I don't think anyone really would argue that seems like a reasonable markup. However, the hospital then looks at it and says, well, but if I mark down that one drug, then you're going to take me down on all the others, and then I'm going to be underwater on my overall contract. So that's the reason we see that, the stakeholders all have different relationships and contracted relationships, and that's why, yes, these will be primarily under the medical benefit, but we can see drug delivery happen under the pharmacy benefit. But again, I don't think that we should be focused on necessarily trying to drive that one way or the other. It's really, let's go the path of least resistance that will enable the patients to get treated most cost effectively.
Any questions from the audience? Oh yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead. Well, just shout for the moment.
Yeah.
I'll repeat it.
Hi. Well, it's a bit of a long question.
I'll repeat part of it, the part that I like.
She's coming.
Up in the front.
A great panel, Roger, as always. I think I know you've got a day job, but if you moderated every panel in the industry, we'd probably be making more progress. So I guess let's begin with the principle that I think everybody in this room is actually committed to the same thing. Regardless of our business, we're actually trying to have people live happier, healthier lives. But isn't it the case that we just have different business models, particularly in the cell and gene therapy space, I think, that are just fundamentally at odds with each other? So we're working on therapies that are going to be massively impactful if they're successful. They're going to save lives or radically change lives for decades. Because you can only work on those kinds of opportunities right now with the modalities we're talking about. And so if you are successful, you're going to price accordingly. But your businesses, particularly on the insurance side, in this country, what's the average dwell time of a patient? And somebody mentioned it earlier, it's like 2.5 years, right? So you're looking year to year, trying to figure out budgets, trying to figure out how in the world you're going to be able to cover all the lives you have, and make that budget work that year. Yet a lot of the benefit is being conferred long after the patients that you're covering are gone from your plan. And so I don't understand how we're going to get across this sort of chasm without trying to think about some kind of addressment of that. And should we be talking more about something like pooled risk, pooled benefit kind of system for these long-term benefits? Because if somebody's life is saved, we need to assign appropriate value to that. But if that doesn't fit with an annual budget, that to me seems like that's the crux of it.
Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd be glad to start with that. You were exactly right. Agree on all parts of that, in that this is one of the largest challenges that we have. But we're fundamentally looking at this, and I think this is absolutely true. Employers, health plans want to see the patients benefit from these therapies. We are really in an incredible age in modern medicine where we've got curative or at least long durability therapies that are coming to market. This is what we've asked for all along, and it's up to us to figure out how to enable patients to have access to it. And frankly, I think on the commercial side, we've got to be as innovative as the manufacturers have been on the development side in bringing these therapies to market. And just an example that I'll just bring up, we recently announced the Embark program, which is still taking shape right now, but the idea behind this Embark program is that, we're not in there's one solution, but we're thinking there's only one solution. This is bringing yet another solution out there to address the needs of certain stakeholders that are looking for predictability and affordability. So the program in a nutshell is that payers can participate on a predictable amount, PM. It's less than $1 a month. They participate, and then the drugs that are covered within this program are paid for by the program. So that doesn't necessarily make the therapies cheaper themselves, but it is a way of pooling resources to make them more affordable. And so what that really solves for are the payers who are struggling, or employers who are struggling with this. I'll hear the word lightning strike used a lot, right? It's this lightning strike. I've got someone in my membership, it's a couple $1 million hit, how am I going to afford this? And the impact that will have on the overall membership. This is, again, predictable, affordable way to enable them to provide coverage for gene therapies. And we're committed to continuing to innovate, and I think we have to as a commercial marketplace.
This really is an innovative idea, and it's basically bringing reinsurance closer to the actual employer who's ultimately paying the bill in this case. How do I have prevent the possibility of not one person having this disease, but maybe there are twins in a family, and it bankrupts my plan.
And you mentioned reinsurance. Let's call that stop loss, because a lot of folks think, oh, well, stop loss insurance will take care of this. Well, stop loss insurance is it's not the bottomless mug, right? I mean, because what happens is chronic therapies, you get lasered out, meaning that specific patients get excluded in the following year. But on these high cost, high impact therapies like that, there's the risk of premium increases the following year. So that's the reason that we have to continue to look for alternatives for this, and don't just assume that existing stop loss is going to take care of it. And in response to that need is what kind of led to the development of the Embark program.
Well, we have just gotten the hook, so we're going to get off the stage now. But thank you for listening to us, and Bernie, Bill, John, thank you very much.